Welcome back. Now, I'm going to say at the start of this, I'm not turning off the air conditioner for this video. It is very hot today. I don't feel like, working up a sweat by the end of this video just standing here. So the air conditioner may turn on during this video. Just going to let you guys know. So today I decided, what if I measured the power rankings of every team that I've watched play from 1980-81 until now. So the first season that I watched the National Hockey League regularly was 80-81, where the New York Islanders win the Stanley Cup over Minnesota. Now you'll notice I've got here moved before 2023-2024 because I have to have 32 teams, but Utah's not going to get. I think Utah's going to end up probably being a better team than what we saw in Arizona. We get that feeling, don't we? So I'll get through these ones first. There are 6 teams. I'm wearing Colorado Rockies, who moved a couple years after I started watching, and they're the first team that goes on the board. Now, this magnet here is technically the Avalanche Reverse Retro, but notice, yeah, it's the Colorado State flag. So I was like, all right, I don't have a Colorado Rockies, but yeah, they never made the playoffs when I was watching. And in terms of I keep wanting to say defunct when I'm talking about this, but the Atlanta Thrashers are next at fifth on this board in terms of teams that have moved before 2023-2024. Fourth on the list is the Whale. What this also means is that what these teams did, I am not weighing that in the ranking of the teams that are 1 through 32 here. I wanted to separate that out. The original Winnipeg Jets are third on the list. They didn't have a great run, but it was a little better than Hartford's, better than Atlanta's, and better than the Colorado Rockies. Number 2 on the board, the Quebec Nordiques. Again, technically, this is an Avalanche Reverse Retro magnet, but it is the Nordiques logo. And I was like, well, that works. I can use that. And so, yeah, there you go. And so number 1, amongst the teams that have moved, the Minnesota North Stars. Made the Stanley Cup final twice in the time I was watching hockey, and generally were pretty good. They made a conference final in there as well. And of course, when they started to tail off, that's when they ended up being moved. So there you go. It's more weighted towards the Stanley Cup playoffs, but the regular season's taken into consideration as well. It took me about 2 hours to get all the information done so I can rank 1 through 32. So now that you guys understand, and I haven't made the internet mad in a while, and I was like, I need to make the internet mad. So number 32, and again, weighing the whole run, is the Arizona Coyotes. Yep. So I couldn't put Utah up because I haven't played a game yet. So there you go. We're in that no man's land with the Arizona Coyotes. Number 31, rounding out the bottom row on the board, is the Columbus Blue Jackets. So what weighs them down is they miss the playoffs regularly. They haven't won the division. Arizona did reach a conference final at one point, but they've missed the playoffs so many times that they still ended up being weighed down to bottom of the list out of the 32 teams that played this season. So it would be hard for me to do this next summer because then Arizona's in this area and Utah only has one season to go on. Yeah, difficult. Number 30, moving up into the next row, Buffalo. Buffalo's been bad for a very long time, and I feel bad for Sabres fans. And I mean, considering how good Buffalo has been at times during part of the 80s, the late 90s, definitely with Hasek, it's sad to see the team 30th on the board overall. But yeah, the math definitely puts them in 30th. 29th, a team that struggled throughout the 80s, has had a lot of long stretches of struggles. Toronto. The fact they haven't reached a Stanley Cup final, they haven't won a Stanley Cup, leads to Toronto being 29th. But, they've won a couple of division titles, and they did get to the conference final a few times in the mid-90s, early 2000s. So they did get some points that kept them out of the bottom place, but they need to get more. They need to show a little bit more come playoff time. And again, I weighed like division titles, playoff appearances, but yeah, Toronto still ends up 29th on the board. 28th, another Ontario team, the Ottawa Senators. The Sens, of course, their first season in the NHL was miserable, like catastrophic. But for the Ottawa Senators, they've had some good runs here and there. However, in the end, they still end up 28th on the board overall. And so that's two Canadian teams on the board right next to one another, and they're both from Ontario. You know what? I'll turn the air conditioner off. I'll soldier through. If I'm a bucket of sweat at the end of this, I'm going to apologize. It heats up very, very quickly. I'm right next to the garage, so it heats up very quickly. All right. So number 28 is Ottawa. Number 27 is Florida. Now, what's interesting is there's a lot of points for winning a Stanley Cup. What it does is it keeps Florida from being right near the bottom. The Florida Panthers were run so badly for so long that it's going to take a few more really strong seasons, and I think they're going to get them. They may end up winning another Stanley Cup as well. Florida, and I've been looking at teams here and there. I'll look at Florida and what they've lost since they won the Stanley Cup. But that Stanley Cup win keeps them out of, I'd say, 30th without those points. You just take a quick look at my board. Yeah. Without that Stanley Cup win, they'd be ahead of Columbus. They'd be ahead of Arizona. They would not be ahead of Buffalo. So that Stanley Cup win absolutely pulls Florida ahead of where they would have been. But this just shows how inept management was. And again, people always talk about, oh, nobody goes out to watch Arizona games. I wonder why. Oh, Florida, nobody went to Florida games. I wonder why. Once those teams are run pretty well, all of a sudden people show up. It's really strange. It's like Buffalo doesn't get anybody in attendance. Fans seem to understand because we accept Buffalo as a hockey market. Number 26 is Minnesota. So the Minnesota Wild end up 26. They've had one conference final run and not a whole lot to speak of outside of that, and that was in 2003. So yeah, Minnesota 26th on the board. I don't think Wild fans are going to be surprised by that. I think there's going to be some people that are upset with where some teams are on the board. But again, I went over the math a few times, and I actually started this, and then I started over. I was like, nope, I got to start over. Again, 2 hours putting this together. Number 25 is the Winnipeg Jets, the current Winnipeg Jets. And what's interesting is, and I'm again looking at the board, the numbers between the old Winnipeg Jets and the current Winnipeg Jets are almost the same. So this is a franchise that's had its mediocrity. They haven't been in the Stanley Cup final, neither the original Jets or the current Jets. And of course, Arizona never got there either. So if you're a Jets fan right now, you can type into the comment section, and that's why attendance goes down. But yeah, the Winnipeg Jets, 25th on the board. I really want to see them do well. Absolutely want to see them do well. 24th, the Seattle Kraken. Now, they're only 3 years into their existence, but I had to go by the point system. I couldn't just not have them on the board because they've only had the 3 years. But yeah, Seattle 24th. Not too shabby, only being 3 years into your existence and being ahead of the other teams. And Seattle's a team that I'm already seeing articles about how they could get right back to the playoffs. I know there's a lot of people that would like to see them back in the playoffs. I don't know if they're going to get back to playoffs, but I think they'll be better next season than this season. And who knows, the next time I tabulate a list like this, they're probably going to end up being a little higher. Number 23, the Nashville Predators. Now, Nashville's a team that we know has been aggressive in the offseason so far. And the expectation is Nashville's going to be potentially trying to win the division this next season. I think between them and the Avs, I think those are probably going to be the power of the division, but it looks pretty wide open, so we'll see how it turns out. But Nashville, I do like the additions in the offseason. This is a team that's been to one Stanley Cup final, of course, and it's the first team on the board with the Stanley Cup final other than Florida and Ottawa. Ottawa had that Stanley Cup final in 2007. So, yeah, Nashville ends up 23rd on the board. They've had some good seasons. It's about maintaining it, and adding who they've added in the offseason should help. At number 22, Vancouver. I'm not surprised Vancouver is 22nd. Like, it's so bizarre that in this channel's existence for I think it's 7 years I've been doing power rankings. It's 6 or 7 years. Vancouver seems to reside in the third row. That just seems like it's the place where they end up. So when I was tabulating the numbers at the end, and again, I'm not giving away my formula, but there's a positive and a negative. Vancouver, it ended up tabulating to a 0. And I was like, that checks out. Yep. That. So everybody on this end of the board has a negative value. Everybody from 21 and up has a positive value. Vancouver is just 0. They're even. It just feels like the most Canuck thing they could be. I'm really hoping that the next time I do this, they're higher up on the board. I don't know, maybe a Stanley Cup. Stop laughing. It's not nice. Hurts my feelings. Number 21, a team that did win a Stanley Cup back in 1989, the Calgary Flames. Calgary and Vancouver being next to each other feels just about right. If you go look through these teams' histories, they're not dissimilar to one another. Calgary does have that Stanley Cup win in 1989, which differentiates the two organizations. But yeah, they've struggled with maintaining that spot at the top. I think Calgary's best run was the one where they won that Stanley Cup, and since then they've never really consistently been a top team. Vancouver, I've talked about it before, they get to be a top team here and there, but consistency over, and I'll say like a 5-year period, has eluded them. So that's your third row. Second row, the San Jose Sharks at 20th. Now, the regular season gets San Jose to 20th. If they'd won a Stanley Cup, they'd be higher up, but they haven't had that Stanley Cup win. They've had the one Stanley Cup final appearance. That was in 2016. So, yeah, San Jose ends up 20th on the board because I had to weight it so that Stanley Cup victories are really important. And even then, certain Stanley Cup champions haven't been ranked higher. But, yeah, San Jose ends up at 20th. At some point in time this summer, I want to do a video talking about San Jose at their peak and how good they were and some of their best players and how they just couldn't quite get over the hump. Talk about teams that set them back. So, yeah, look for that this summer. Number 19, staying in California, it is the Anaheim Ducks. The Anaheim Ducks, of course, won the Stanley Cup in 2007. But it's been some lean years since, 2019? It's been lean since, I think they last made the playoffs in 2018. So from 2019 till now, that's dragged their numbers down. So it's still a positive because they're over Vancouver. But notice how the Pacific Division is showing up a lot at this point. So there's been some rough seasons for Pacific Division teams for sure. And Anaheim, I think, is starting to, put things together. But are they going to end up being last overall in the NHL this year? They very well could be. We'll see. I think predicting last is just as tough as predicting first. Number 18, Carolina. The Canes went a long stretch without playoffs. And I did, when I was weighting this and putting this together, I thought, if a team's been outside of the playoffs for a 5-year stretch or a 10-year stretch, they kind of need to have more of a penalty for that than a team that just misses once or twice and gets back into the playoffs. So the long stretch Carolina went outside of the playoffs hurt them. Of course, they won the Cup in 2006, right before Anaheim won it in 2007. But after they won the Cup, they then went without Stanley Cup playoffs. They went to the conference final in 2009, and then there was no playoffs for a very long time. So, Carolina's had their struggles. Better than Hartford. I will say better than Hartford. Looking at the board here, yeah, it's not even close. If I had included Hartford with the Carolina number, Carolina would have been down right below Vancouver. So by separating those out, it moves Carolina ahead. So that's part of the reason I wanted to do that. Number 17, another California team, the LA Kings. They had the Stanley Cup in 2012 and the Stanley Cup in 2014. They went to the Stanley Cup final in 1993. They had some conference finals there. They've also had a lot of seasons where they missed the playoffs. And again, going back to 1981, the 80s were a pretty tough decade for LA. So when you average it all out, they average out to 17th. So LA making the playoffs the last few years, but getting knocked out in the first round, that's not helping them either in terms of generating enough points to move up the board. And so they're 17th. And that puts them right near the halfway mark, just above the halfway mark at 16th out of 32, which is half. So halfway mark. It's the New York Islanders. Now, what keeps the Islanders higher than everybody else is the fact they won the Cup in 81, 82, and 83. Now, if I'd been watching hockey in 79, 80, and I generally didn't, but if I'd been watching hockey in 79, 80, the Islanders would be substantially further ahead than they are. Those back-to-back-to-back Stanley Cups, each year they beat a team I was rooting for. They beat Minnesota, then Vancouver, and I really wanted the Oilers to win in 83. The Oilers would get that win in 84. But since that Stanley Cup final appearance in 84, it's been some lean times for the New York Islanders as well. So they generate a lot of points at the start of what I was using to measure this out, and then they just don't. Conference final appearances helped, but yeah, they end up 16th on the board overall because they've had some rough times. 15th, the Philadelphia Flyers. They're due for a Stanley Cup final run. The Flyers have those every now and then. They don't win in the Stanley Cup final, but they do have those Stanley Cup final runs, and that's part of how they end up 15th. If they'd won a couple of those Stanley Cups that they appeared in, say like, I don't know, 85 or 87 or 2010 or 97, any of those Stanley Cup finals, they'd be much higher up on the board, but they are where they are. Let me just do the math here. So if they had done that, let's say they just had won one of the Stanley Cups, they would have moved up. I'm just looking at the board over there. Yep, they'd be ahead of them. They'd be in the top 10. They'd be in the top 10. So number 14 on the board, a team that did win a Stanley Cup, the New York Rangers. That 1994 Cup gets the Rangers up to 14th. They've had some conference final appearances. They had a 2014 Stanley Cup final appearance as well. And I think the Rangers are going to get one over the next few years. I think they've got a pretty good roster there. I think with just the right little touches, I absolutely think they can win a Stanley Cup soon. I'm not going to ballpark a date because at number 13 is a team that's won the Stanley Cup once, and that's Dallas. And I feel like Dallas is kind of due as well. What weighs Dallas down a bit? So Dallas had really good runs end of the 90s, into the 2000s, but they've also missed the playoffs a lot too. Dallas misses the playoffs more than people think because Dallas doesn't get as much attention as a lot of the other teams in the NHL. So when Dallas misses the playoffs, there's no, oh wow, I can't believe Dallas missed. But yeah, they go check the stats. Dallas misses the playoffs plenty. Right now, though, it feels like they've got a really good run going. A lot of good young players to go with the veterans. It should coalesce into a championship at some point. Will I still be alive for it? Who knows? Number 12. Also a team with the Stanley Cup. The 2018 Stanley Cup, to be precise. The Washington Capitals. So they've had their lean years as well. And of course, in the 80s, they had some really good teams that just didn't get over the hump. Could not win that championship. So, yeah, Washington ends up 12th on the board. I don't think they're going to be upset with that. They did win a Stanley Cup. So, the Stanley Cup helps. So there you go. Number 12. Number 11. Vegas. Vegas, if you look at the overall stats, their win-loss record's fantastic since they came into the league. People hate them over it. And I get it. I do. If you watch your expansion team, struggle for 5 years and they can't get anything done, and then they finally get better. And then Vegas comes in, and through genius general manager work by George McPhee and some questionable trades that other GMs made, Vegas has been really good throughout most of their existence. They've missed the playoffs once in 7 years. That's remarkable. So, Vegas ends up 11th. That Stanley Cup definitely helps. Gave them a bunch of points. And again, they just don't miss the playoffs. So they end up just outside the top 10, even though they've only got 7 years in the league. Number 10, St. Louis. So the Blues with the 2019 Stanley Cup. The other thing that keeps them in the top 10 is they've made the playoffs a lot. So going back to 81, they made the playoffs a lot. Even the year that it looked like they could move to Saskatoon and there was a lot of concern about whether or not the team was profitable, and they ended up not going to the draft because they weren't allowed to move to Saskatoon. I may need to do another video on that soon because I'm aware there's a lot of people who are subscribed to the channel now that weren't back then when I did a video on that. It's a bizarre story. But St. Louis ends up in the top 10. They're number 10 on the board. So kudos to them for that. Number 9, a multiple Stanley Cup winner. And I'm looking at, and the Kings are a multiple cup winner. The Islanders are a multiple cup winner. And now at 9, we've got the New Jersey Devils. It is remarkable that considering some of the 80s and some of the recent history, the Devils are still in the top 10. They have 3 Stanley Cups to their name and a Stanley Cup final, actually 2 other Stanley Cup final appearances as well. When New Jersey is good, they tend to be pretty good. It's part of the reason I took them to win the Stanley Cup this year, which they had to make the playoffs to win the Stanley Cup, and they didn't. So not my proudest moment. But, the Devils end up number 9 on the board, and we'll see, maybe they get that 4th Stanley Cup this year, and if they do, they'll probably move up into the top 5 if I do this again next year. Not saying that I will, but I might. Number 8, Tampa. The Tampa Bay Lightning, of course, 3 Stanley Cups. I know. People, those cups don't count. The players don't care. The fans don't care. People can say it all they want. The reality is the Tampa Bay Lightning have 3 Stanley Cups to their name. And if other teams had won, I guarantee those fans of those other teams would have said, well, this cup counts. So, yeah. Tampa Bay ends up at number 8. What drags them down a bit is that they had some lean years there where they missed the playoffs. Definitely the 2019 upset at the hands of the Columbus Blue Jackets prevented them from getting points out of that season. But Tampa Bay, when they're good, they're generally pretty darn good, and they're pretty tough to beat in the playoffs. Number 7, I was surprised by this one. Montreal. Montreal was good enough in the 80s, the early 90s, that they've stayed in the top 10 when I got all these numbers put together. I was surprised. I was genuinely surprised. I went over it too. But really, outside of now where they're going through the rebuild, they've generally been really good. They did make the Stanley Cup final in 2021. So there's a lot of reasons that Montreal ends up in the top 10. Kudos to them for that. They're almost the best Canadian team on this board at number 7. So there you go. And the most recent Canadian team to win a Stanley Cup. Number 6 on the board is Chicago. Now, Chicago would have been higher if not for the fact that, man, this team was bad. This team was really quite bad in the late 90s, early 2000s. And it's interesting because in the early 90s, it looked like with Roenick and Belfour and Chelios, this team was going to win at least a Stanley Cup, and they didn't. So, yeah, Chicago, the 3 Stanley Cups they've won, puts them up in the top 6. But the rough patches they've gone through, and some of the drafting in the late 90s, early 2000s too, didn't help them out any. But yeah, Chicago ends up number 6. I was actually kind of surprised they weren't higher up. I did, as I said, I went through and I kind of started over, and I felt like I needed to weight things a little bit different. If I hadn't, Chicago may have been down around 8th or 9th or 10th. Number 5, mild surprise at 5, the Boston Bruins. They have 1 Stanley Cup win, of course, in 2011, in the time I've watched hockey, but they've been consistently a playoff team through most of the time I've watched the game. I started watching in 81. The first time they missed the playoffs in my time watching hockey was 1997. So, and they had Stanley Cup final appearances in there. They've had, I think, 4 runs to the Stanley Cup final and not one, and then they won the one over Vancouver. So all of that just kept pegging them up points, and so the consistency Boston's had through most of their existence has them in the top 5. That Stanley Cup win doesn't hurt either. Without the Stanley Cup win, they would have been below Chicago. They still would have been ahead of Montreal, but just barely ahead of Montreal. But yeah, number 5. Number 4, the Colorado Avalanche. So again, 3 Stanley Cups helps. Having a pretty darn good team helps. The only thing keeping them from being higher is they went through that really rough patch of their own before, with Matt Duchene and the really bad season, and when everybody thought Sakic should be fired and gone and waited too long on Duchene. You don't hear much about that anymore. You don't. And so when people are criticizing Steve Yzerman now, I think about that. I think, people criticized Sakic plenty until the team all of a sudden was really good. Then it all went away. So for Colorado, they're still a contender. I will not be surprised if they win another Stanley Cup. Nathan McKinnon, if he can replicate what he did this season and they have a little bit better luck in the playoffs, they could win another. All right, number 3, the Oilers. So what buoys the Oilers up and keeps them in the top 3 is 5 Stanley Cups, numerous Stanley Cup finals as well, 2006 as well as 2024. So that definitely helps. Looking at the Oilers, if they didn't have the Stanley Cup final this year, they would have been below Colorado. So that moves them ahead of Colorado. But yeah, the Oilers, best of the Canadian teams that I've watched in my time watching hockey because they had those 5 Stanley Cups. Yes, the most recent one was in 1990, but I'm weighing this over the entire time I've watched hockey, and the Oilers still one of the best teams. And I will not be surprised if they're the Canadian team that breaks this drought that Canada's been in. Number 2, Detroit. What's interesting, too, is that at the time I started watching hockey, Detroit was a miserable franchise. Nobody wanted to play in Detroit. Nobody wanted to go there. And yeah, it was rough. Marcel Dion gets traded to LA in the time before I started watching hockey. And the guys traded for Dion didn't want to go to Detroit. No. It was just kind of a thing. So no trade lists. Detroit would have been on him. And back then you didn't have no trade lists. You just didn't report. That was just the way it worked. And then the team would suspend you. You're not getting paid, but you're also not playing for a team you don't want to play for. So the Detroit Red Wings, remarkable turnaround once they got Yzerman. And now Yzerman's the GM, of course. And even though they've had a long stretch without playoffs, just the 4 Stanley Cups and how good they were for how long they were puts them at number 2, which means number 1 on the power rankings is Pittsburgh. What is it, 5 Stanley Cups? Yep, 5 Stanley Cups in my time watching. So they're tied with the Oilers for the most cups in my time watching hockey. And for Pittsburgh, you have the Lemieux era, you have the Crosby era, and now the expectation is at some point in time they're going to have to rebuild. And who's going to be the next one after Sid? Who are they going to draft that's going to be the next big superstar? Or what are they going to do to find that next big superstar if they don't get that number 1 draft pick? So for Pittsburgh, it's been remarkable. When Pittsburgh's bad, they are historically bad. Like, they are awful, usually by design, because they know who's coming up in the draft. Sort of like what Chicago did with Bedard in the draft, where it was just, we're just going to bottom out. San Jose did that this year with Celebrini. I will not be surprised when Pittsburgh does it again, and they get their man. They get the guy they're looking for. They did that with Lemieux, where they intentionally were the worst team in the league, trading away good players to just keep getting worse. And with Crosby, they just... I don't know how intentional that rebuild was. They just all of a sudden were really bad, and they just sort of stayed bad for a while. They got Malkin one year and Crosby the next, and yeah. It's quite the story with the Pittsburgh Penguins. Of course, it was a lottery where they get Crosby, where all 30 teams were in the lottery. There was plenty of discussion, plenty of complaining about the fact that Pittsburgh won that lottery, but it was weighted towards the teams that were bad, and Pittsburgh was one of the teams that were pretty bad. So there you go. Power rankings from 1981 through to 2024. All set. And you guys can let me know your thoughts in the comment section below as always. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Once this is done, I'm turning that air conditioner back on because it's warmed up substantially in here over the time I've been doing this video. But thank you guys so much for all your support as always. I do enjoy doing power ranking videos. This is for people who might have been missing some of the power ranking videos because I haven't done one since the end of the regular season. The next power rankings on the channel for current hockey will be... I'm aiming for August the 1st. So, or the first Saturday in August. Maybe that's August the 1st. I haven't looked. But yeah, stay tuned for that. But let me know your thoughts. Hit like and subscribe if you haven't done so already. Thank you guys so much for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.